I want to begin by thanking you all for attending this afternoon. As you can see, I am already in PhotoFrame 4.6. I'm working in Adobe Photoshop 5.1, I believe, CS. And I want to talk about a couple of things very quickly before we actually start working on this image. Under Options, please note that I have checked Apply Each Frame to a New Layer. The reason I want to do that is I want to take advantage of one of the most powerful aspects of PhotoFrame 4.6, which is the ability to layer multiple frames one upon the other in order to get some very dramatic effects. So let's go back to the frame stack. I'm going to assume that you all have a measure of comfort or familiarity with PhotoFrame, so I'm not going to spend a terrible amount of time on it. On the interface itself, obviously the InstaFrame edges if you wish to add bevel, and this tool I find very interesting for controlling the angle of the bevel. And finally, in terms of controlling the properties of the layers themselves, you can see them here. What I'm going to do now is open the library, and I'm in the library. I want to call your attention first to the section called User. Over the years, we've continued to collect multiple textures, and we continue to add them to the frame library. And as you can see, again, if you're not completely familiar, there is a rating system that can be used. So, for example, if I come down to Filter Results and simply click on the 5 stars, then all of those textures that I've added that are simply 5-star have now appeared. I can apply that same filter to all images. Images, by the way, or filters are categorized, as you see here, adornments, art supplies, backgrounds, etc. Excuse me. So let's get started. Initially, I've been asked many times, do I know what the finished image is going to look like? Not so much when it comes to frames. I generally have a very good idea of what I want to do with an image in terms of processing it. And this image in particular uses a style that we call color over. It's not a complete color image, but it's not a complete black and white image either. So what I think I'm going to do is pick up the detail of the stone, and let's try this frame first. And you can see it has applied it. Now, one thing I want to do, you may notice the white line that I have here. I'm going to just extend the frame over. And by the way, this is a way in which you can apply the frame to part or all of the image. But typically when I see that white line, it tells me that the frame has not, or the texture is not completely applied. And now I'm going to come over to my Layer Properties window. And as you can see, I'll be very careful here for those of you with slower internet connections to take my time. Depending on which layer property I'm working with, I get a very different effect. Now, I tend to move toward the less dramatic, particularly in an image like this, so I'm going to leave it on soft light. I'm going to go to my color window, and I'm going to explore possibilities for integrating this into my image. So I'm going to try contrast. I'm going to try transparent first. Not terribly powerful. I'm going to go back now. Let's see what the background color will do, if anything. Typically when I'm using soft light, as I am here, I'm not going to get a powerful amount of that frame added. But that's okay, because what I'm trying to do here, in particular, she's in front of an old copper door in an abandoned house in central New York. So from an emotional perspective, I'm interested in beginning to age her to match the detail of the house where this photograph was created. So let's go back to our image library now. And I'm going to look for a wood texture. And I'm going to do essentially the same thing, but this time I'm going to make it a little bit more pronounced. And again, I'm going to double click. And I'm going to stretch that texture just a little bit. So once again, you can see the frame has been applied, but in this case, the layer property, being normal, completely obscures the image underneath. So I'm going to try and look for the particular layer setting that's going to give me what I'm looking for. And in this case, I'm particularly fond of the overlay because it not only brightens the image, but it also, as you'll see momentarily, will retain some of the texture which is underneath it. So if I now take my layer opacity and drop it down just a little bit at a time, and again, I'm going to go slowly here so that you can see what's happening. I've, in effect, allowed more of the texture, the original frame, to come out. And again, I can come back here to color, and I can experiment and look for a color that's going to effectively highlight that. One of the very nice features I discovered rather by accident the first day that I had PhotoFrame a number of years ago was the ability to add a shadow. And when I add a shadow, I can begin to add to the density and the impact of the frame. And as you can see here very slightly, I've added a very thin black line, and that's true also in the more center parts of the door. I can also add a glow. And again, I'm going to go to black, which in this particular texture won't be quite as powerful as it would be, but that's okay because I'm not always looking for a powerful effect. Sometimes the most powerful emotional effect can be achieved simply by softly applying multiple layers one upon the other. And my goal here with this image, again, is to take a color over photograph, which would have been circa the early 1920s, the days in which photographs were hand painted over film, and make this image look like it is aged. In this particular session with the model, we were talking about Evanescence's first CD, which had just been released, and the sense of loss and sadness. So I asked the model to listen to the music and tell me in her gesture how she would react to the songs. And this was one of a number of images that we got in that process. So I really don't want to disturb that emotion. I want to enhance it. And to give you an idea of what can happen if you add a texture that's too powerful, I'm going to go back to the library. By the way, there is no right or wrong in the application of a texture, so if I'm implying that there is, my apologies. My point, rather, is that the application of a particular frame should always be consonant with the emotion that you want to portray or the visual features that you want to highlight. So to pick one that's just completely out of left field, you can see that in this case, even if I change to a different layer, it's just completely out of context with the model. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to delete it. Now, another reason why I prefer to use the apply each frame to a different layer is because it allows me to reorder my layers on the fly. And in this case, I'm going to bring my opacity on this layer back to 100%. I'm going to change my layer type from overlay to multiply, which will darken that. And then I'm going to come back to the layer that I just moved, and I'm going to drop its opacity until I start to bring the wood, which you can now see underneath it, more to the foreground. And at this point, I can also experiment with my color, whether it's with the eyedropper or by going to the color wheel. And again, notice in this case, because my opacity is 61%, the overall impact of what I'm doing is very subtle, very careful, very gentle. So if I want at this point to add my shadow and add a little bit more drama, I can do that. But let's go back to the wood on the top. There we go. And let's go back to where we were very quickly, because we're going to take this back to Photoshop. And we're going to show you how to integrate that into a finished image. By the way, it's often helpful. If you see where my mouse is, there's actually a little eye. I'm going to take this layer and make it invisible momentarily, because I want to make sure that as I go back to my original configuration, I have my first layer screened, or the opacity set to a point where it's going to be effective, accomplishing what I want to do. And as you can see, I'm beginning to get back to a more powerful presence of that image. So let's leave it at soft light this time. And now let's go back and turn this image layer back on. And I'm going to change it from soft light. And I'm going to pull my opacity back. And let's change it to white. And we'll highlight it and lighten it up a little bit in the back. Okay, so we've added the grain now, and I want to make sure that I drop this opacity down so that I make that wood a bit softer, and so that I'm also able to take advantage of the fact that I've got a layer underneath it. So let's go ahead now. Okay, we're almost there. Good. And now you can see that with the combination of the layers, I'm actually using the first background composite to add shading and to soften the overall effect of the wood. Let's go back to Photoshop now. My goal while we're waiting for this to come back to Photoshop is to get through at least 2 very different images, possibly 3. I would like to stop at approximately 1/4 of the hour to answer any questions that you might have. As is the case with any aspect of working in a digital world, the importance of repeatability cannot be underestimated. So in everything that we do, we approach it in much the same way, working the variables until we achieve the emotional effect that we want. So momentarily now, we should be back. I apologize for the slight delay, but between GoToWebinar and Photoshop, 8 gigs of RAM doesn't go as far as it used to. For those of you who are wondering, I'm working on a Windows 7 Pro 64-bit system, but I have chosen to work in 32-bit Photoshop at the moment. Okay, there we are. Now, if you look in the Layers palette, you'll notice that I have a PhotoFrame layer. And if I click on the down arrow and then click on PhotoFrame itself, you can see that the layer properties have been changed to pass through. At this point, both the layers within the pass-through, which have been created obviously by PhotoFrame, and the PhotoFrame group itself can be further adjusted and or manipulated. So watch what happens when I change pass-through to multiply. I'll wait a minute for all the screens to catch up, and you can see that she's now appreciably darker. Let's go look at screen and overlay. And you can see that this produces almost a posterized effect. Again, I'm going to zoom in a bit so that you can see what I'm about to talk about. If we look over in this corner, you can see the texture of the wood still coming through, and you can see the shadowing of the first layer underneath it, particularly in the areas around this part of the copper door, which is what I was looking for. Now, I'm going to stay with this effect, that is changing the properties to posterizing, but I'm going to do two things at this point. I'm going to drop my opacity down a little bit, probably to around 70%, because I want to bring some of that detail back out. There she is. Now the next thing I'm going to do is come back to my original layer. I'm going to select the lasso tool. I'm going to set my feather to approximately 150. This is a technique I often use in this situation. Unfortunately, I don't have my stylus. I'm doing this with essentially my mouse. And now I'm going to do right-click, layer via copy. Now, if you look back at the layers palette on the right side of the screen, you'll notice that I now have a copy of the background layer. I'm going to drag that all the way to the top. And now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to look for a layer property that will help her stand out, but will still allow me to bring much of the background through. So there we are. I can continue to work with different layer types. For example, I could add a luminosity layer. And the idea here is to be able to further fine-tune what I've created by working with various texture options that are available to me. For the most part, and I know there are certainly exceptions, the photograph that was used as the thumbnail for this presentation is one. The bulk of the work that I do with PhotoFrame tends to be a little bit less obvious, particularly for the fine art photography, for which this certainly qualifies. So at this point, we can continue to fine-tune the image. We could go into Photo Tools and convert this to black and white. There are an infinite number of possibilities. So let's put that image aside. Let's go on to another one. This is a portrait that has already been converted to monochrome. And what's very interesting about this is that I want to make it look like marble, or I want to make it look like a pastel print. I can now do that. So let's go ahead and launch PhotoFrame. Okay, and here we are. At this point, let's go to a background and a composite. And I'm going to look for one that's going to give me some swirls that I'm going to be able to tailor to the contour of the model's face. And to make this a bit easier, I'm going to select using my 5 stars, which gives me the ones that I typically use or that I favor to use in this situation. Okay, let's select this one. And let's fix this. Now, if I change my layer properties here, note, let's go to multiply, that'll make it easier, that in this case the scroll is directly over her face. I really don't want it there. It would be much better for the overall effect of the image if it came down the right. So if you notice here, I have a flip horizontal tool, and I'm going to do that. And now I've taken advantage of the fact that there's a natural shadow across the back of the model's face, and I'm going to use that now to leverage the power of this tool. I want to come back again because I'm not sure whether that or perhaps soft light And for the sake of, once again, adding more than one texture, let's go with the soft light here. Let's leave the opacity where it is, and let's go back to the image library. If I click back on all items again, I have the ability now to scroll through all of those that are my 5-star. And in this case, I think I'm going to want to add a little bit of purple back because the original monochrome image itself had that. And once again, I'm going to make that adjustment. And I'm going to flip this one vertically and then horizontally and make my adjustment. And now let's again change the opacity. And this time I think I'm going to go with either a screen or an overlay. Let's go with the overlay because I very much like the way that complements, again, her face. And this time I'm going to drop my opacity down until I just bring a tad of the previous look and feel in. Now, one more thing before we go back to Photoshop and finish this image. Let's go back to Open Library. And let's talk about one of the more advanced features, which is the ability to create a preset. And you'll notice that under Night Falcon, I've created a folder in which I can now add presets. So if I want to add this current, I'm going to click. It's going to ask me to name it. And I'm going to say ISIS 1. I'm sorry about that. I'm not sure what its problem is. But at this point, it's a matter of clicking and saving, and I've got my preset all set and ready to go. And that's a really good advanced feature. So let's go back and close that. And now let's go back to Photoshop. Okay. There's my Save Preset button. Okay, so at this point, as soon as it brings it back into Photoshop, we'll be able to show you how we're going to finish this image up. And then we'll take a look at a color image. Okay, here we are. And as was the case before, here's my background composite layers. And I'm just going to sort of turn off so you can see how they look in Photoshop. So there's my original, my first, my second. Now there's a number of interesting things that we can do at this point. We have the ability, for example, to come back in, highlight a section, create a layer. Notice that this time, if I put it in between, I've added a layer within, and now I can further tailor this. For example, if I use this as a screen or an overlay, and you can see I've had the overall effect of lightening her face. And let's now drop the opacity here. So what was initially almost too dark now has a layer of color that's been added to it. And so we've gone from that to that. So typically when I begin working on an image, I try to envision the kinds of textures that I'm going to want to add and how the adding of those textures is going to enhance the visual imagery. So in this case, that's an okay monochrome photo. But to my eye, at least, it's nowhere nearly as powerful as that. And in fact, a very similar version of this has won a number of awards, which initially struck me as rather interesting, especially for a photograph. So let's go get another one. We have about 15 minutes left. And let's see. This is the one from which the thumbnail for this presentation was made. I'd like to spend a minute or two talking about how to analyze what textures might or might not work, because there is a kind of method to all of this. For example, notice how bright the upper left-hand corner is, and by contrast, how dark the lower right-hand corner is. You have a very bright blue here. You have a very dark brown. And there's a visual tension caused between the tree line in the far distance, a statue in the nearer distance, and the current statue. There's also a line of very large flower pots stretching down the right. So as I'm thinking about this, I'm remembering what it was like to be in Paris in the fall of 2007 in the midst of 2 to 3 hours of sun, the only 2 to 3 hours of sun we had that day. And I'm in my mind beginning to ask myself how I can capture the kind of starkness that I experienced despite the presence of all that color. I should also say that we have been very heavily influenced by an early turn of the 19th, 20th century photographer by the name of Atget, and that his sense of black and white and the texture that you would expect from a photograph that was 100 years old now often influences how we treat older architectural monuments and scenes like this. So having said that, let's head on into PhotoFrame. And I have PhotoFrame set up to automatically bring up the image library because that works very well for me. The first thing that I want to do is begin to think about the base layer. I'm probably going to use 2, possibly 3 layers here in order to achieve the effect that I want. And as I did before, I'm going to go back to composites. And in this case, I want to shift the colors in the photograph to the browns. So I'm going to add this. And once again, I'm going to pull the frame back just a little bit because I know that with my camera and the size of my images, I have a tendency to sometimes have a white spot. And now, as we did before, I'm going to begin looking for a base texture that's going to add to the image but not necessarily change it too much. And actually at this point, I really like the overlay. I'm beginning to get a sense of the texture in the clouds, as you can see, which is very nice. And I'm beginning to add more of the brown into the grass. So let's go back to the library and let's see if perhaps we can find something with more of a pattern. And I've shifted to 5 stars, as you can see. Let's try this. And once again, I'm going to extend the frame just a little bit. So let's go back to our layer properties. Obviously, that's a bit too dark, too light. Okay, but it's not giving me everything that I want. That's interesting, but it's almost a little bit too much. So let's go back, and we're going to go with multiply, or we're going to go with overlay. And I think for the case of making it very dramatic, we're going to go ahead and go with multiply. And let's drop our opacity a little bit so that the texture begins to come through, but the texture is not so powerful that it takes away absolutely everything in the image. I like the water stains or the ink stains on this effect. And we can try one more here really quickly. It's a texture I just picked up today. And it's down in my user. And I'm going to get rid of all my stars. And we'll see how it does. I've discovered that with certain images, sometimes a little bit too much white when you're viewing it is an indication of the fact that the paper may not do that well. So let's go ahead and try it. And if it doesn't work, then we will try one more before we go back. And I'm going to change it. And I'm going to alter my color to transparent. And we'll see what that does. Give it a second to redraw. And I think I may actually try the background color. A little bit too much. Let's cancel that. And we will temporarily go with this. And now, for the sake of seeing what the overall effect of shifting my columns around might be, okay, let's leave it right there, and let's put it back the way it was. All right, now, one thing, I'm going to create a preset. Sorry about the previous error, when things sometimes happen unexpectedly. If I click on Save Preset now, it's going to ask me to name it. And I'm going to say that this is Paris, Luxembourg Gardens. And I am the creator. And I'm going to change the folder to Night Falcon. And I'm going to say that this was used to be the base for a monochrome image. Okay. And now that preset is created so that if I wish to use this effect again, I'm able to do so very quickly. Let's go back now to Photoshop. I'm going to very quickly make this a monochrome image in Photoshop. It's not typically the way I do it. We do it through on one's tools. But I do want to save some time for questions, and I want to look at one more image if we can before we do that. So we're about to come back into Photoshop now. Okay. And once again, let's just look at our layers. And let's see if we come to the top, if making any changes in the pass-through will enhance visually what we're doing. Probably a tad too dark for what I want, so let's just leave it at pass-through at the moment. And I'm sure that if you've used Photoshop, you know how to do this. My apologies, I just got some kind of an error message, but hopefully the internet connection will heal itself here. If I go to mode and then I change it to grayscale, I'm not going to merge. I will discard. And now I'm free to play. In this case, if I wanted to create a tritone, I can go ahead and do that. And the image that you saw earlier was created along these lines. But for the moment, let's do this rather quickly. And I'm going to pick up a darker brown. Okay. Again, ordinarily, not the way this is done. A lot more time is spent. But in the interest of being able to move forward, it gives you an idea of what can be done in order to create a powerful image. Let's undo that so you can see the monochrome. And we'll leave it at that for the moment. The art of creating monochrome from textured layers in PhotoFrame is itself the subject of a good webinar. So perhaps we can come back to that. Let's very quickly look at one more here. A notoriously difficult image. I have deliberately bleached it in the monochrome layer. I'll show you the original color. And in this case, before I go into PhotoFrame, I'm going to drop the opacity of the black and white. so that some color comes through. This is a slightly different way of doing the color over. One of the young model I showed you at the beginning of the webinar was actually done on the raw image. So let's go to PhotoFrame now. And by the way, if you, oops, perfect resize. Sorry, mouse is quicker than the eye. If you haven't explored the presets that come with PhotoFrame, there are a wide variety that are really quite good. So let's go look at that. Here's one that I used, by the way, and let's see what that does. Okay, it's applied it. In this case, just a single frame. I'm going to make sure it's large enough. And let's go back to Photoshop. And hopefully momentarily we'll be back in Photoshop. And similarly, as I've done before, if I want to highlight, retain that sense of color over, but also add the aging effect that I've placed on this slide, I'm going to do a layer for, via copy. And by the way, if I use a smaller feather, I can actually make a sharper cut. But I kind of like the effect that I can achieve here. And now I'm going to leave my layer as normal for the moment, and I'm going to start dropping my opacity and my fill. And there it is. Now, there are many more things that I can do, a lot of ways in which I can change, a lot of ways in which I can restructure this image, and even go back into PhotoFrame one more time and add a pocket of layers within a pocket of layers of textures. An extremely powerful way to create multiple images. Brian, have we any questions at this point? How are we doing?
There are a few. So Falcon, first of all, the feedback has been fantastic. Your
Thank
cadence
you.
and thank you. What I would like to ask is there were a few people that asked when you started talking about the pass-through blending mode, if you can just discuss that really quickly, and then I have just two other questions.
Okay. By definition, PhotoFrame uses an option that's not normally part of Photoshop's layers. Let me demonstrate. If I go to Mono Layer and I click on Layers, all the layer properties are displayed there. But there's an option which is not, as far as I know, documented, which allows content to be added in a group. And when content is added in a group, that option is called pass-through. I'm going to pause so that you can see my mouse and follow where I am. What Photoshop doesn't tell you, and what we discovered rather by accident, is all the rest of the layer properties are still there. So to just walk through a couple, luminosity, as you can see, picked up the gray of the monochrome, leaving the color intact and leaving the brown edge intact other places. If I switch up to soft light, the entire group virtually disappears. If I switch to overlay, I darken the image and I add drama. And if I pull in a little bit, you can see the line, I hope, that I'm tracing from the frame underneath. And at this point too, by the way, while I can't control the fill of a pass-through layer, or a layer that was originally passed through, or a group, I can nonetheless control its opacity. So let's try a couple of other blending modes here. Screen. And the screen often has the effect of lightening the image, as you can see. And let's go one more. Multiply. Now, if we had time, there's some very interesting things that we can do, and I'll just do one really quickly here. I'm going to duplicate this layer, and I'm going to drag it to the top. Come on. There we go. Okay. In this case, I've actually used my monochrome layer as a filter, and I've intensified, as you see here in the corner, I've intensified the overall visual effect of the textures underneath it. So what I'd like you to think about here is the application of a texture in PhotoFrame is the beginning of an immensely powerful creative process that gives you the opportunity to take your images well beyond a simple monochrome or a simple color image. In this case, for example, before I get to one more question here, I'm going to zoom in on the area, and look how nice the texture coming through and how much more sense of depth I've added by having done that. And now if I want to lighten the image, you know, there are thousands of ways to do that. I'm going to assume that you know how to add a brightness layer or a curves layer, or use your tool of choice to be able to further customize this image. So I hope that was a clear enough explanation. Brian, on to the next question, or is there another question about this?
There is a question back. You mentioned how you picked up someone asked that they heard you say you picked up some textures. So if you could just talk about, do you purchase textures? Do you just obtain your own textures with a camera? And just to, I can kind of preface this, there were a bunch of questions of, can you import images into PhotoFrame? And first of all, you'd be happy to know that Falcon actually recorded a video on our website a couple of weeks ago that specifically shows how you can import a file into PhotoFrame. So if you could just address that, that would be great.
Yes, I've gone to the user section now. PhotoFrame is going to take a bit of time doing this because essentially I'm now creating a layer of textures or a group of textures within textures. If you look down here at the bottom of the library window, there's a plus, and I'm going to click on that. Now, these are already in my library, but I'm going to go ahead and import it anyway so you can see the process. I'm just going to randomly pick this Bible cover, click on OK. I missed this my first go-around, so I'm going to read it to you and we can focus on it for a bit. The frame is copied by default to the user section unless it is from a previous version of PhotoFrame, in which case most of the time it's put where it was in the earlier version. We've been using PhotoFrame, I think, since either late in 2 or early in 3. So we typically keep those old libraries around and we re-import them every time a new database comes up. That's number one. Number two, I'm just going to go ahead and click on OK here. It tells me that it's already there. Do I want to replace it? I'm just going to cancel it in the interest of time. Number two, you can collect them from anywhere. DeviantArt, for example, has people who routinely create textures. Smashing Images is an online magazine. They routinely do the same. I have often Googled free textures or free vector art, and my camera is my best friend and never lets me down. So whenever I'm out and I find something interesting, whether it's a tree trunk or a broken piece of metal or whatever, I just bring it back and process it and get it ready and add it to my library. Really pretty easy. So just to illustrate the point, by the way, of how you can stack groups within groups, I'm just going to select this brick. And you're really not going to see much at this point because it doesn't, I have to do some things to make it understand the overall fact that it's now on top of a library. By changing the properties, let me go back, this will make more sense. By changing the properties of the group to multiply, I basically have blocked the information going to PhotoFrame. So if I want to nest images or text or textures within, I have to make sure that's passed through. That's a key point. So let's quickly go back to PhotoFrame now and launch it. And you can see it's now reading all the information, and it should, if I apply that frame now, show it on top of everything. So when you go back, you can actually have multiple layers of frames nested. Best, however, to not change anything, like I added this layer which is not readable by PhotoFrame, and that layer which is not readable. But if you leave that initial group exactly the way it was, you have no problem doing multiple layers. Now, when would you like to do that? It really depends on where you want to take an image. There are some times when I'm quite happy here with a very powerful color image. But there are some times when I will then convert this image to monochrome, maintain the layer, the colors underneath it, and then go back into PhotoFrame and create an even more complex image. Sorry about the long answer, but I hope that did help.
Great help.
Next question, Brian.
Actually, I've got it for now. I just handled the other questions here.
Okay.
But that was fantastic, and just I also wanted to add. So first, I put the DeviantArt website in the chat module for everyone to click. It is an excellent place. Falcon's 100% correct. Another place that I found for textures, if you're looking for them, on Flickr, there's I don't remember the name of the group. Just do a search for free textures, and there's a group where people just give high-resolution texture files for free. Obviously, you'll want to do the right thing and give credit whenever you're posting your image who the owner of the texture is. But I've used that source many times, and it's just a great way to, like Falcon said, add depth and dimension to your image. It's a wonderful way to kind of, a lot of times, I think, Falcon, you might agree, there's a great image. Unfortunately, for instance, maybe the sky it's a majority of your frame and it's just either blown out or there's no character to it. But the image itself is very salvageable. Textures, I think, do a really wonderful job when you kind of tastefully apply it, as you have, beyond just slapping it onto the image. So I really admire that.
I'm sorry, Brian. You're absolutely right. And if I could add two things to that. One is, please do look at the video that we did for On One about organizing your image library within PhotoFrame. It helps immensely to be able to focus on the kind of organization that can speed your development. Number two, I learned very early that you can mix color and monochrome with PhotoFrame, and as you've seen, produce some incredible images. Layer properties both in Photoshop and in PhotoFrame are a tremendous way to take your images to the next level. And lastly, to kind of review, I've done a lot of tweaking and playing of late here, so I apologize for some disorganization. Presets are a great start, guys, but they're not necessarily the end of everything. And the ability to use the presets, which I'm sort of scrolling through here, that come with On One's PhotoFrame is a fantastic way of being able to start out and find your way around. And secondly, as you develop your own, don't hesitate to apply them and use them. For example, I'm going to quickly apply this Catherine Wood to the image of Isis. And I'm ready to go. I can now customize this. I can change the things I need to change to make it applicable to this particular image. It not only saves time, but it gives you a really good base to begin creating. And in the end, the difference between an average photograph and a fantastic photograph is your creativity and your insight into the images that you've created with your camera. So I hope that helps. It's a phenomenal tool, and we are every day very thankful for our ability to use it. Any other thoughts, Brian, or comments or questions?
My one comment is just it was a very insightful webinar. You know, these webinars, the Pro Series track for me oftentimes is very self-serving because I get to glean insight from our partners, most of the times I'm the one that's doing the webinar, so it's just me working. And you kind of touched on something right there at the very end that I think is critical, and it differentiates, I think, the 95% of photographers from the five, and that is, for instance, using a preset as specifically and solely as a baseline to build on. It's not something that you kind of set it and forget it. You applied that preset you created, and you said, you made it a point. Now I can start building on that, and that's important.
Exactly. No two photographs are the same, as you know, Brian, and I'm sure everyone who's watching this webinar understands that as well. Particularly if you're shooting here in my time zone, it's now a few minutes to 6. The golden hour, such as it is at the end of February, is in full swing. In 5 minutes, I could take the same photograph. Everything has changed and everything has moved. The ability to begin on a very quickly establishable platform and then really get into the art of the photograph is just fantastic. So with PhotoFrame, from correcting images that are blown out, like the one of Luxembourg Gardens in the upper left-hand corner, to photographs as simple and initially unimaginative as this headshot of Isis. It's a phenomenal tool, and there's just so much you can do with it.